The British Parliament received a report that no one wanted to read out loud. It described how the sugar that the English put in their tea every morning was produced. The children who cut cane in Jamaica died before turning 12 years old. Adults rarely reached 40. The plantations consumed bodies with the same efficiency with which the mills consumed cane, and Parliament read it, filed it away, and continued lowering tariffs so that sugar would be cheaper. This is the true story of sugar. The product that built fortunes, sank entire civilizations, corrupted science, redesigned the global economy, and has been installed in human history for 10,000 years, without almost anyone knowing where it comes from or what it costs to bring it to your table. Because it is not just an ingredient, it is the substance around which the greatest empires of the modern world revolved. And the story of how it got here is quite a bit darker than what any nutritional label could suggest. It all starts in New Guinea, approximately 10,000 years ago. A massive island in the South Pacific, covered in dense, humid jungle, without writing or wheels or forged metals. There, in that context, the inhabitants of the highlands discovered a tall grass with a thick stalk that grew wildly on the banks of rivers and in forest clearings. They bit into it. The liquid that came out was something completely different from anything the human diet had known until that moment. Concentrated, pure, immediate sweetness. Sugarcane in its raw state. The discovery did not generate any trade, any elaborate ritual, any industry. For thousands of years, that was exactly the extent of it. The stalk was chewed, the juice swallowed, the fiber discarded without processing, without transport, without refining of any kind, just the direct act of biting a plant and receiving sweet energy in a world where sweetness was scarce and valuable, where honey was the only available sweetener, and getting it meant facing a honeycomb. The cane spread slowly throughout the Pacific, following the migration routes of the Austronesian populations, who navigated the ocean in wooden canoes with a nautical skill that Europeans would not match until hundreds of years later. From New Guinea, it reached the Moluccas, the Philippines, what is now Indonesia, the Malay Peninsula, mainland Southeast Asia. In every place it took root, it was basically the same. A food that was chewed, not a raw material, that was processed, something people consumed in the field, not something transported in ships or stored in warehouses. The cane had a biological limit that for millennia seemed insurmountable. The juice ferments and spoils in hours. It cannot be kept. It cannot be carried far. Once the cane is cut, you only have a certain amount of time. The leap that changed everything happened in India around the year 3500 BC, although some records point to experimental cooking processes even earlier. The farmers of the subcontinent did something that seems obvious in retrospect, but required centuries of observation and trial and error. They learned to squeeze the cane with wooden presses, boil the juice in clay pots over direct fire, and let the liquid concentrate until, upon cooling, it crystallized into brown, granular solids. They had solved the problem of time. Crystallized sugar could be stored for months without spoiling. It could be loaded into sacks and transported along the trade routes connecting the subcontinent. It could be sold, traded, offered. They called it kunda, which is where the English word candy comes from, and from which the family of words designating artificial sweetness would eventually derive in dozens of languages. India had just invented sugar as a product, as a commodity, as an object of desire that could be separated from the plant that produced it. The Sanskrit texts of the time describe it with a respect bordering on the liturgical. The Atharva Veda, one of the 4 oldest sacred texts of the Hindu tradition, mentions sugar as an appropriate offering for the gods. The doctors of the Ayurvedic system, which at that time was the most sophisticated medicine in the known world, prescribed it for a list of ailments ranging from headaches to vision problems, from general weakness to persistent fevers. The Sushruta Samhita, one of the foundational texts of Ayurvedic medicine, distinguishes between 17 different types of sugar according to its degree of processing, its origin, and its therapeutic properties. At a time when most of the world did not know the product existed, that says something about how long the Indians had been working with it. The merchants who traveled the trade routes between the subcontinent and Persia began transporting sugar westward around the 1st millennium BC. It reached Mesopotamia, the markets of Babylon, the Persian cities of the Achaemenid Empire. It was sold in tiny quantities at prices that put it completely out of reach for anyone who was not part of the ruling elite. The Persians learned the production methods and began to cultivate cane in the warm, southern regions of their territory along the Persian Gulf and in the irrigated plains of Khuzestan. It was in Persia where the refining technique took its next step. Persian artisans developed methods to wash the crystals with water and partially decolorize them, obtaining a whiter product with a finer texture. Sugar was no longer just a brown powder of plant origin. It was beginning to acquire the quality of visual purity that for centuries would make it more desirable. In the year 326 BC, Alexander the Great crossed the Indus with his army and penetrated the territory that is now northern Pakistan. One of his officers, an admiral named Nearchus, who had commanded the Macedonian fleet in the Indian Ocean, sent a dispatch describing something he had seen in the fields of the Indus Valley, a reed that produced honey without the need for bees. The phrase was recorded in the annals of the expedition and circulated among Greek intellectuals for generations as a rarity of the Eastern world. But it went no further. The Greeks did not transport the cane. They did not attempt to replicate the crystallization process. They did not establish any regular import system. For Alexander and his successors, sugar was exactly what Nearchus described: a curiosity from the margins of the known world. Rome did not do much more either. When sugar appeared in the markets of the Eternal City, it arrived in small quantities through the Arab routes from Persia and India, at prices that made it practically inaccessible. Pliny the Elder mentioned it in his Natural History in the 1st century of our era, describing it as a kind of honey that formed in reeds and had the consistency of salt. A pound cost the equivalent of a month's salary for a manual laborer. Roman doctors, following the Greek tradition and the growing influence of Eastern medicine, prescribed it for eye infections, stomach problems, and as a healing agent. It was not a food. It was a luxury drug that the bulk of the population would never see in their lifetime. And during the following centuries, while the Roman Empire crumbled and Western Europe fell into what historians call with some condescension the early Middle Ages, sugar practically disappeared from the European horizon. The trade routes that brought it were interrupted. The knowledge of how to produce it remained on the other side of a sea that few Europeans crossed. The one who truly changed the fate of sugar was Islam. The Arab expansion of the 7th century was one of the fastest and most geographically ambitious historical phenomena in ancient history. In less than 100 years, the Islamic Caliphate had absorbed Persia, Egypt, North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, and a good part of Central Asia. And with those territories, it inherited something of incalculable value: the Persian sugarcane plantations. The refining knowledge that Persian artisans had developed over centuries, and the trade networks that connected all those places together. The Arab scientists and chemists of the 8th and 9th centuries took that legacy and took it several orders of magnitude further. They perfected the juice purification process, using techniques that involved quicklime to neutralize acidic impurities, clay to decolorize the liquid, and successive filters that progressively eliminated suspended particles. The result was a fine, uniform white sugar of a quality that nothing in the product's history had matched. The Arab geographers of the Abbasid period, who wrote with a precision that had no equivalent in the contemporary world, described in detail the cane plantations spread across the irrigated plains of Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean coasts of Palestine and Syria, the Nile valleys in Egypt, and the orchards of Al-Andalus in the Iberian Peninsula. The geographer Al-Muqaddasi, writing in the 10th century, listed the sugar-producing regions with the same meticulousness with which a modern economic report would catalogue oil-producing regions. Sugar was the energy of that civilization in a very concrete economic and cultural sense. It financed constructions, sponsored science, and sweetened a cuisine that in terms of technical sophistication would have no rival in Europe for centuries. The medieval Arab cooking recipes that have survived show a use of sugar that is surprising, even by modern standards. It was used in savory dishes with meat and spices. It was mixed with rosewater and crushed almonds to make what we would call marzipan today. It was dissolved in water, perfumed with lavender and saffron, to prepare drinks that doctors prescribed as tonics. It was boiled with fruits to create preserves that allowed the flavors of summer to be consumed in the dead of winter. This entire culinary universe was operating fully and sophisticatedly in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, at a time when the Northern European diet consisted basically of bread, cabbage, and salted pork. Arab sugar reached Europe by two paths, both violent in their own way. The first was the Reconquista. As the Christian kingdoms of the northern Iberian Peninsula progressively recovered territories from the Caliphate and the Taifa kingdoms during the 10th, 12th, and 13th centuries, they found in the reconquered areas something they did not expect: a sophisticated agriculture, elaborate irrigation systems, and sugarcane fields in full production around Malaga, Motril, and the Granadan coast. The new lords did not destroy those plantations. They inherited them, maintained them, and learned from the Mozarabic and Mudahar workers who knew how to manage them. Andalusian cane sugar began to circulate through the Castilian and Aragonese courts before the Crusaders returned from the Eastern Mediterranean with their own experiences. The second path was precisely that. In the year 1096, Pope Urban II called the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont, promising eternal salvation to those who took up arms to recover the Holy Land. Tens of thousands of European warriors, most of them second sons with no lands of their own, driven by faith, ambition, and a lack of prospects at home, marched toward the Levant. What no one told them is that they were also going to discover a substance that would forever alter their domestic economies. The Crusaders arrived at the Syrian ports, the markets of Acre and Tripoli, the Palestinian coastal cities, and found something they had never seen: entire plantations of cane and markets, where refined sugar was sold in perfect white cones. They tasted it and reacted with a mixture of amazement and greed that their chroniclers recorded with a sincerity that in retrospect is almost comical. William of Tyre, who wrote the most detailed chronicle of the Crusades, called it a most precious product, very necessary for the use and health of mankind. The knights returned to Europe with swords, religious relics, oriental diseases the continent did not know, and bags of sugar that they offered to their feudal lords as the most valuable treasure they had found in the East. European demand began to grow before there was any local production capacity to satisfy it. Venice became the gateway and did so with the calculated precision of a power that understood perfectly well that the control of trade was more powerful than the military control of territories. The Venetian Republic, geographically located at the crossroads between Eastern Mediterranean trade and the domestic European markets, established trade agreements with the Crusader states of the Levant and with the Egyptian sultans at the same time, with a diplomatic hypocrisy that its contemporaries admired and its rivals hated. They imported raw sugar from Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. They refined it in their own facilities on the islands of the lagoon and distributed it throughout Europe through a network of agents and trading posts that stretched from Lisbon to the Black Sea. For almost 2 centuries, Venice controlled the European sugar trade with unrivaled firmness. The families that controlled that trade, the Grimani, the Contarini, the Cornaro, accumulated fortunes that materialized in the palaces of the Grand Canal. which today are museums and luxury hotels. Sugar literally built some of the most famous architecture in the world. In medieval Europe, sugar became a first-class status symbol, an indicator of wealth as clear and as efficient as lineage or territory. The banquets of monarchs included elaborate sculptures carved in sugar, representations of castles, heraldic animals, or biblical scenes that were displayed on the table as a demonstration of economic power, before being destroyed and consumed by the guests. The English term subtlety, which designated these sugary constructions, appears in the court's account records from the 11th century. At the wedding of Henry III in the year 1236, the royal court spent more than £300 on sugar for a single banquet, a sum equivalent to the annual income of a mid-ranking nobleman. Apothecaries sold it under lock and key alongside opium, and the rarest spices in small doses wrapped in paper with the care and solemnity with which a doctor today issues a prescription for a controlled drug. If you could afford sugar, you were somebody. If you couldn't, you would probably die without ever having tasted it. Medieval pharmacists prescribed it for a catalogue of ailments that covered practically all the medicine of the time, for dry coughs and wet coughs, for long fevers and sudden fevers, for heart problems and stomach problems, for melancholy and weakness, for eye ailments and skin ailments. The logic was partially correct. Sugar is indeed caloric, and in patients weakened by hunger or illness, it provides rapid energy in a measurable way. But the scarcity of the product also invested it with a magical aura that amplified its therapeutic reputation far beyond what its real properties justified. The rarity made sugar powerful even before the body absorbed it. The structural problem of all this demand was obvious. Sugarcane requires a tropical or subtropical climate to grow. It cannot be grown in England, it cannot be grown in France, nor in the Netherlands, nor in any of the economies that demanded it most. The winter isotherm that separates temperate from tropical climates crosses the Mediterranean along a line that leaves Europe almost completely outside the viable cultivation area. The continent depended entirely on a supply chain that passed through Islamic territories with which it was in intermittent religious war, and that chain was expensive, irregular, and politically complicated at best. Demand grew relentlessly. Local production was a climatic impossibility. Trade routes were vulnerable to any political alteration in the eastern Mediterranean. Someone had to find another solution, and they did so in a way that no one in the 14th century of our era could have foreseen. Portugal was the first to see it. At the beginning of the 15th century, under the impulse of the House of Aviz, and with the intellectual sponsorship of Infante Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese began a systematic exploration of the Atlantic that had commercial motivations as concrete as any modern expedition. In 1419 they reached Madeira, a volcanic island in the Atlantic, about 1,000 kilometers from Lisbon. The climate was warm, humid, with regular rainfall and no frosts. Perfect for sugarcane, the Portuguese planted it. In less than 20 years, Madeira was the largest producer of sugar in Europe, with a production that far exceeded that of any other available source for the continental markets. The fortunes it generated financed part of the subsequent Portuguese explorations. Madeira sugar reached the courts of Europe and successfully competed with the Arab product in quality and price. It was the first great success of the model that Europeans would later replicate on a much larger scale. Almost immediately, they faced the same problem that would be repeated on every continent over the next 4 centuries. Sugarcane required an amount of physical labor so brutal that no one did it voluntarily if they had another choice. Cultivation is devastating from the beginning. You have to prepare the land, which on the volcanic slopes of Madeira meant building irrigation systems, the so-called levadas, channeling water from the peaks to the fields with engineering that was in itself a monumental work. Then planting, clearing, weeding, harvesting with a machete, under a sun that in the central hours of the day is unbearable, even for those accustomed to it. Carrying the cut stalks to the mill within hours, because the cane begins to lose its juice the moment it is separated from the root. The mills operated non-stop during the harvest season. The shifts in the boiling houses were endless. Injuries were constant and varied. Machete cuts in the fields, crushing in the mill rollers, burns from splashes of boiling juice in the cauldrons. The owners of the Portuguese plantations first tried with poor peasants from the metropolis itself, attracted with promises of land and wages. It didn't work. Mortality was too high, and the survivors left as soon as they could. Then they looked south, towards the coasts of West Africa, where the slave trade networks between local kingdoms had been operating for centuries. The island of São Tomé, off the coast of what is now Gabon and Equatorial Guinea, became the laboratory where the forced labor system was designed and perfected, which would later be scaled up to dimensions that would have been unimaginable to any observer of the time. The Portuguese established plantations in São Tomé in the 1480s and supplied them with enslaved people from the Congo and Angola. The climate was perfect for cane. The labor force was unlimited as long as the infrastructure existed to capture and transport it. The yields were extraordinary. The model worked with an efficiency that erased any scruples the investors might have had, because the investors of 15th century Europe did not operate with moral categories that included the humanity of Africans in a practical way. São Tomé was not just a plantation, it was a prototype, the place where Europe learned that the combination of tropical land, sugarcane, and slave labor generated unrivaled profitability in the economy of the time. When Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492 and reached the Caribbean, his second expedition 2 years later included something that textbooks do not usually mention alongside the horses and pigs and missionaries: sugarcane cuttings, taken from the plantations he had seen in Madeira and the Canary Islands during his preparation for the voyage. Columbus knew exactly what they meant. The Caribbean had the ideal climate. It had the rain, the heat, the humidity, the expanse of flat land that the crops required. The quality of the soil was in many cases superior to that of Madeira. The only thing the system lacked was labor. And Columbus already had the São Tomé model to know how to obtain it. The first experiments with cane on Hispaniola produced results that exceeded all expectations. The Spanish colonists reported to the Crown that Caribbean sugar was of exceptional quality and that the conditions for producing it were incomparably better than on any European plantation. The news reached Madrid, Lisbon, London, Paris, and Amsterdam with the speed that economic interests have always had for traveling. In a few decades, the Caribbean was transformed into the greatest sugar-producing machine the world had ever seen. Spain established mills in Cuba, Puerto Rico, on Hispaniola. Portugal poured immense resources into Brazil, where the northeast of the country, particularly the regions of Pernambuco and Bahia, became the first great sugar complex of the modern world. England entered late, but with ferocity, taking Barbados in 1627 and Jamaica in 1655. France settled in Martinique, Guadeloupe, and the western half of Hispaniola, which would eventually become Haiti. The Netherlands, which had their own Caribbean colonies, and also a crucial participation in the slave trade that supplied their competitors' plantations, completed the picture of a Caribbean turned into an extraction zone on a continental scale. In the 1650s, the small island of Barbados, with a territory of about 430 square kilometers, approximately the area of the city of Madrid, within its outer ring, produced more sugar than all of Brazil. It was the most valuable colony of the British Empire, more profitable than the sum of all the North American colonies, combined, more wealth generating per square kilometer than any other territory under the English flag anywhere in the world. The English knew it, valued it, and defended it accordingly. During the wars of the 16th and 17th centuries between the European powers, Barbados and Jamaica were priority strategic targets. In the peace negotiations of the Treaty of Paris in 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War, Great Britain had to choose between keeping Canada or the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe, which at that time produced more sugar than all of British North America combined. The decision to keep Canada was considered by many contemporaries to be a gross economic mistake. The process of making sugar on those Caribbean plantations was, in physical terms, one of the hardest and most dangerous jobs that existed in the world of the 18th century. There is no way to soften it with language. After cutting the cane with machetes for hours under the Caribbean sun, the workers had to carry the heavy stalks to the mill and feed the continuously running machinery. The rollers of the mill, driven by oxen walking in endless circles, or by the force of the wind in the sail mills that dominated the landscape of Barbados, crushed the stalks between cylinders of iron or hardwood to squeeze out the juice. The workers who fed the stalks into those rollers risked their fingers, their hands, their entire arms with every movement. A moment of distraction, a stumble, the cane pulling the hand inward, and the mechanism continuing to turn because the oxen do not understand stop signals. The plantation owners solved the problem in the coldest way imaginable, keeping sharp axes hung in visible spots near each mill so the overseer could amputate the trapped limb before the entire body was crushed. It was a standard procedure documented in the plantation management manuals of the time. After the mill, the boiling house, the extracted juice passed to a battery of copper cauldrons arranged in a row, each over its own wood fire, each regulated to a different temperature. The workers, barefoot in many cases on hot and humid dirt floors, transferred the boiling juice from cauldron to cauldron, using long-handled wooden ladles, skimming off the foam, monitoring the viscosity, judging by eye and experience the moment when the liquid was ready to pass to the next phase. The heat inside those rooms exceeded 60 degrees Celsius, even in the early hours of the morning. Burns from splashes of hot juice were so constant that no one recorded them. The operation was continuous during the weeks of the harvest because the sugar did not wait. A day of stoppage could ruin weeks of work. Shifts lasted up to 20 hours. Those who fell asleep while working were beaten awake. Not out of cruelty from the overseers, but because falling asleep next to a boiling cauldron of sugar amounted to not waking up. The entire Atlantic economy was reorganized around this system in the space of a century. The so-called triangular trade, which historians describe with that cold geometry that erases the human scale of what it represents. It worked simply and brutally. Ships left the European ports of Bristol, Liverpool, Nantes, Lisbon, and Amsterdam, loaded with textiles, weapons, alcohol, and cheap European metal utensils. They arrived on the coasts of West Africa, in the arc that goes from what is today Senegal to Angola, where these goods were exchanged with local kings and merchants who provided people captured in wars, raids, or simply sold for debts or internal disputes. The ships then loaded their human cargo and crossed the Atlantic in what was called the Middle Passage, the 5 to 8 week crossing between Africa and America that became one of the deadliest episodes in modern history. The enslaved traveled chained in the space between decks, in a space so small that they could not stand up, with insufficient ventilation, scarce water, and a density of people that turned any disease into an epidemic in a matter of days. Between 10 and 20% of those embarked died on the crossing. Those who survived arrived physically destroyed at the ports of the Caribbean and Brazil. There they were unloaded, sold at auction, tattooed or branded with a hot iron to indicate which plantation they belonged to, and sent to the fields where in some cases they began working before having had time to recover from the journey. The ships then loaded sugar, rum, molasses, and cotton, and returned to Europe, where they sold those goods with margins that in modern terms would make any venture capital investor pale. Then they loaded European goods again, and the cycle recommenced. The port cities that participated in that cycle built with their profits the churches, palaces, universities, and infrastructure that today are considered European cultural heritage: the Merchant Hall of Bristol, the historic docks of Liverpool, which today are a museum, the Bourse of Nantes, the canals of Amsterdam, all have in their foundations, in one way or another, the work of someone who never saw Europe and who did not live to see the monuments their effort financed. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, approximately 12 million people were torn from West and Central Africa and transported across the ocean. Most of those who survived the journey ended up on the sugar plantations. Barbados received so many enslaved people in such a short time that the African population outnumbered the white population by a ratio of 10 to 1 inch, the middle decades of the 17th century. The sugar mills of Jamaica consumed workers with a speed that made it necessary to constantly import because mortality was so high that populations did not reproduce fast enough to keep pace. An enslaved person on a 17th century Jamaican plantation had a life expectancy of between 7 and 10 years. After arriving on the island, owners made the calculations with the same coldness with which a modern rancher calculates the life cycle of their cattle. It was cheaper to buy a new worker than to invest in the conditions that would allow them to live twice as long. Those who tried to escape were hunted by militias of hunters organized specifically for that function. Those who actively resisted were executed using methods designed to serve as a public warning. Those who survived long enough to develop some useful knowledge for the plantation, a good eye for the cauldrons, skill with the mill machinery, ability to supervise other workers, were promoted to overseer positions that turned them into instruments of their own system of oppression. Sugar colonialism not only exploited people, it precisely designed the psychological mechanisms that turned some of those people into functional accomplices in their own exploitation. In 1791, something happened that no one in Europe or the Americas had foreseen as a real possibility. The enslaved people of Saint-Domingue, the French colony in the western part of Hispaniola and the most productive sugar plantation in the entire world, producing at its peak of performance approximately half the sugar and coffee consumed in Western Europe, rose up in a rebellion that took 12 years to resolve. The trigger was the French Revolution and its proclamations on freedom and the rights of man that the enslaved of Saint-Domingue heard, read in clandestine papers, and decided to take literally, with a literalness that terrified the very French revolutionaries who had written them. Toussaint Louverture, a man who had been born enslaved and had educated himself by reading Julius Caesar and the Enlightenment philosophers, organized an army that successively defeated the French colonists, the Spanish troops who tried to take advantage of the chaos, the British who invaded the island hoping to take control of the plantations, and finally, the expeditionary force that Napoleon sent with the explicit order to restore slavery. Dessalines completed what Louverture had begun. In 1804, Haiti declared itself an independent republic, the first black republic in the world, the only successful slave revolution in all of modern history. The French response was neither recognition nor reconciliation. It was diplomatic extortion. In 1825, King Charles X of France sent a war fleet to the Haitian coasts with a proposal that was actually an ultimatum. Either Haiti paid France 150 million gold francs as compensation for lost properties, including the value of the enslaved who had freed themselves, or France would not recognize independence, and the diplomatic and commercial consequences would be devastating. Haiti accepted because it had no choice. The debt was renegotiated several times throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The final payment related to that original loan was made in 1947. 122 years of payments for the right to have stopped being enslaved. Several economists who have studied the impact of that debt on Haitian development conclude that without it, the country could have invested in infrastructure and education during the 19th century at a rate that would have fundamentally changed its historical trajectory. In Europe, while debates on abolition gained strength in parliaments and pulpits, the very nature of where sugar came from was about to change radically. The Napoleonic Wars blocked Atlantic trade and sent prices skyrocketing. A Prussian scientist named Andreas Sigismund Marggraf had demonstrated in 1747 that the common sugar beet, a plant perfectly cultivable in the European climate, contained the same sucrose as tropical cane. His disciple, Franz Karl Eckardt, built the world's first beet sugar factory in Silesia in 1801 and presented it to King Frederick William III of Prussia as a finding of strategic importance. Napoleon grasped the implications immediately. He ordered the planting of 80,000 hectares of beets on French territory and financed the construction of refineries with state funds, because he understood that if France could produce its own sugar, it broke a geopolitical dependence that had been costing money and blood for centuries. Beet sugar was initially more expensive and technologically more demanding than cane sugar, but it worked. And with the fall of Napoleon and the reopening of Atlantic trade, European beet producers received a 30-year period of fierce competition with colonial sugar, which forced them to constantly improve their extraction techniques. By the second half of the 19th century, European beet sugar was competitive in price with Caribbean cane. Europe had broken its climatic dependence on the tropics. The implications for the Caribbean colonies were devastating and accelerated a process of economic collapse that the abolition of slavery would have started anyway. Abolition in the British Empire arrived in 1833. It did not come as an act of spontaneous generosity, but as the result of decades of organized abolitionist campaigning, of rebellions in the colonies themselves that made the system increasingly expensive to maintain, and of economic calculations that began to show that free wage labor could be, in certain industrialized contexts, more productive than forced labor. The compensation, however, was paid to the slave owners, not to the liberated people. £20 million distributed among plantation owners for the value of the human property they lost. The ex-slaves received nothing, neither land, nor money, nor access to the resources of the colonies they had built with their labor for generations. In the French colonies, abolition came in 1848. In Cuba and Puerto Rico, under Spanish rule, in 1886. In Brazil, the last, in 1888. But sugar production did not stop with abolition. The colonial governments developed what they called indentured labor systems. They brought workers from India and China under multi-year contracts signed in conditions where the worker hardly understood what they were signing, and in territories from which they could not simply leave if conditions turned out to be different from what was promised. Trinidad received more than 140,000 Indian workers under this system between 1,845 and 1,917. Guyana received almost 240,000. Mauritius, Fiji, and South Africa received smaller but equally significant contingents. The descendants of those workers today constitute entire communities in those countries with languages, religions, and traditions that survived crossing oceans in conditions that no one would have chosen voluntarily. At the same time, industrial technology was transforming sugar production at a speed that would have been incomprehensible to a 19th century planter. Steam engines replaced oxen in the mills during the 1830s and 40s. Electric centrifuges, developed starting in the 1860s, separated crystallized sugar from molasses with an efficiency that multiplied the productivity of any previous system by several orders of magnitude. The sugar railways laid directly in the cane fields to transport the harvest to massive refineries, transformed the geography of Cuba and Brazil. Industrial chemistry allowed sugar to be purified, to produce white crystals of a uniformity and fineness that nothing in the product's history had matched. That white sugar, refined to abstraction, became a symbol of modernity, hygiene, progress. Brown sugar, which was basically the same product with some minerals that the refining process had removed, was relegated to the markets of the rustic and the inferior. Centuries of history of the color of sugar as an indicator of its purity and status culminated in a commercial prejudice that still exists today in some markets. The confluence of cheap sugar with the Chinese tea that arrived massively in Great Britain from the first half of the 19th century produced the combination that transformed the diet of the European working class faster and more profoundly than any other dietary factor of the time. Unsweetened tea is bitter, hardly palatable for palates that have not been trained in it since childhood. Sugar solved everything at once. A spoonful of sugar in a strong cup of tea produced a hot, energetic, tasty, cheap, and stimulating drink that could be prepared in minutes with minimal utensils. By 1850, the average British worker consumed 2 cups of sugary tea a day. By 1880, it was 4. Sugar imports to Great Britain doubled between 1840 and 1860, and then doubled again in the following 20 years. Parliament deliberately reduced tariffs on imported sugar several times during the 19th century, with the explicit argument that cheap sugar was necessary to keep the industrialized working class energized enough to continue producing. It was economic policy disguised as food policy. The factory owners understood it perfectly. Jam sandwiches and tea with 2 sugars kept workers moving during 12 and 4-hour shifts without the cost of providing substantial meals. Real food, the kind that provided proteins, fats, and complex nutrients, was expensive. Sugar was cheap. The combination of quick calories and stimulation from the caffeine in tea turned out to be the most efficient possible fuel for the Industrial Revolution. Someone calculated the cost of producing human energy with sugar and with bread and chose sugar. That someone had factories to fill with workers. By the end of the 19th century, sugar had penetrated every corner of the Western kitchen. Jams, candies, cookies, cakes, chocolate with added sugar, soft drinks, fruit preserves, canned sauces. The modern food industry was built around its ability to make food taste better, last longer, and sell more easily. In 1886, an Atlanta pharmacist named John Pemberton mixed decocainized coca syrup, cola nut extract, and sugar with carbonated water and called the result Coca-Cola, initially selling it as a medicinal tonic for fatigue and headaches. Apothecaries sold it for 5 cents a glass. In a short time, the company had understood that what it had on its hands was not a medicine, but a drink, and began bottling it. By the early 20th century, it was selling millions of units a year. Pepsi followed the formula with minor variations. Industrialized chocolate bars reached mass markets in the 1920s. Breakfast cereals, originally invented in the 19th century by health reformers who wanted to replace the heavy diet of meat and fat of the American breakfast with something lighter, rapidly evolved into sugar-coated products that contained more of the sweet ingredient than anything else and were sold with drawings of animals and bright colors, specifically designed to capture the attention of children. By 1970, the average sugar consumption per capita in the United States exceeded 50 kilograms a year. The figure did not include the sugar that people consciously added to their coffee or their recipes. It included the sugar that the food industry had put into everything the average American bought at the supermarket without necessarily being aware of it. Bread, ketchup, mayonnaise, salad dressings, flavored yogurts, canned soups, breakfast cereals, packaged cold cuts, meat sauces, condiments of all kinds, all carried added sugar in amounts that no individual consumer would have chosen if asked how much they wanted. The industry had chosen for them because sugar was cheap, improved flavor, extended the shelf life of products on the shelf, and generated a reward response in the human body that made repeat purchases more likely. And while that was happening, someone in the sugar industry knew exactly what it was doing to the human body. Starting in the 1950s, independent researchers in several countries began publishing studies establishing statistical connections between high sugar consumption and cardiovascular risk. British nutritionist John Yudkin of the University of London spent more than 20 years accumulating data that pointed consistently in the same direction. Sugar, more than saturated fat, was the dietary factor that best correlated with the increase in heart disease in Western populations. His 1972 book, Pure, White and Deadly, was a rigorous synthesis of that evidence presented in accessible language. The industry's response was swift, organized, and effective. They funded alternative studies with methodologies designed to produce contrary results. They paid scientists from prestigious institutions to publish reviews discrediting Yudkin without refuting his data directly, but by attacking his methodology. They used their connections with government agencies and medical professional associations to keep any conclusions pointing to sugar as dangerous out of official documents. In 1967, the Sugar Research Foundation, the lobbying arm of the US sugar industry, from Harvard Medical School, the equivalent of about $50,000 today, to conduct a review of the scientific literature on the causes of coronary heart disease. The review was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. In 2 parts, during 1967 and 1968, its conclusions exonerated sugar and pointed to saturated fat as the main culprit for heart disease. The article did not declare the conflict of interest with the sugar industry. The journal's readers, including doctors, researchers, health policymakers, and drafters of government dietary guidelines, had no way of knowing that the conclusions had been commissioned and paid for by the very industry that benefited from them. The impact on the following decades was hard to overstate. The dietary guidelines of the United States, which influenced those of dozens of countries and the school nutrition programs of half the world, adopted the reduction of saturated fat consumption as the central line of their recommendations. Fats were the enemy. Sugar, in comparison, was relegated to a secondary level. The food industry responded to the letter. It eliminated fat from its products and replaced it with sugar and refined starch to maintain the flavor and texture that consumers expected. Supermarket shelves filled with products labeled low-fat, which in many cases contained more sugar than the original versions they replaced. Consumers bought skim yogurts, reduced fat cookies, and fat-free light dressings, unaware that the sugar compensating for the lost flavor was doing something metabolically very different from what the replaced fat would have done. The curve of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome that skyrocketed starting in the 1980s in the United States and then replicated in all countries that adopted similar diets, is consistent in retrospect with exactly what the evidence the industry buried predicted would happen. The documents proving the manipulation did not come to light until 2016, when researchers at the University of California, San Francisco found the internal archives of the sugar industry in a collection of historical documents donated by a deceased executive. The papers showed with documentary precision how the Sugar Research Foundation had identified research that posed a threat to its interests, had hired scientists to produce counter-narratives, and had distributed those counter-narratives through seemingly independent academic channels. The article, with the findings, was published in JAMA Internal Medicine, and the scandal it generated in specialized media lasted weeks, in general media quite a bit less. The industry has been one of the main advertisers in exactly those media for decades, and that coincidence is not completely irrelevant to understanding why the news did not reach the level of coverage that equivalent discoveries in other industries would have received. While research and industry fought in the pages of medical journals, in Japanese laboratories, something was being developed that was going to change the sugar supply in America permanently. In the 1970s, scientists at the University of Tokyo and several Japanese food companies perfected an enzymatic process to convert cornstarch into a liquid sweetener with sweetening power similar to sugar, and in some applications superior. They called it high fructose corn syrup. The timing could not have been more convenient for the US corn industry. The federal government had been subsidizing corn production through agricultural policy for years, in such massive quantities that farmers consistently produced more than the market absorbed, keeping prices depressed and subsidies high in a cycle that benefited large producers and processing companies, but was economically hard to justify. High fructose corn syrup gave them a new destination for that surplus. It was cheaper than cane sugar. It integrated perfectly into liquid products because it was already liquid. It was transported in tanker trucks. It did not require the ships and customs and sugar tariffs that complicated the international trade of granulated sugar. In 1984, both Coca-Cola and Pepsi announced that they were replacing cane sugar with high fructose corn syrup in all their products sold in the United States. It was a purely economic decision. The syrup was cheaper, and the final product tasted the same, or better, according to the consumer panels that the two giants used to evaluate their formulas. Within a decade, corn syrup had replaced cane sugar in most processed foods on the US market. Industrial bakers used it because it mixed better with doughs and produced a more uniform browning in baking. Sauce manufacturers used it because it had less tendency to crystallize. Cereal producers used it because the coating was more adherent and uniform. The generation that grew up in the 80s and 90s consumed more sugar than any previous generation in the history of humanity. And most of that sugar came from an industrial process of cornstarch conversion that their grandparents could not have imagined, and that few of them would have recognized as sugar if it had been explained to them where it came from. Consumption continued to rise. Today, the average American ingests approximately 17 teaspoons of added sugar a day. The American Heart Association recommends a maximum of 6 for women and 9 for men. The excess is hidden in ways that require active effort to detect. A standard commercial pasta sauce contains between 6 and 12 grams of added sugar per serving, equivalent to between 1 and 3 teaspoons, in something perceived as a savory and nutritious food. An industrial-flavored yogurt contains in many cases more sugar per 100 grams than a portion of ice cream. A single standard can of cola soft drink contains between 35 and 40 grams of sugar, equivalent to about 10 teaspoons, more than the recommended daily limit for any adult in a single container. Breakfast cereals aimed at the children's market that are sold with bright colors and animated mascots and promises of added vitamins on the front of the package contain in some cases more than 40% of their weight in sugar. Industrial sliced bread, sold as a neutral staple food, contains sugar in almost all its commercial formulations. Cold cuts, condiments, canned soups, industrial broths all contain sugar in amounts that no one who does not read labels carefully and with prior knowledge of how to interpret ingredients could detect. The health consequences of all this are quantifiable. More than 42% of American adults are currently classified as obese, not overweight, but clinically obese. 37 million have diagnosed diabetes. 96 million have prediabetes, a condition that without intervention progresses to type 2 diabetes in a significant percentage of cases. Cardiovascular disease has remained the leading cause of death in the United States since the 1940s. With the exception of the 2 years when the COVID pandemic temporarily displaced that statistic, sugar is not the only factor. But decades of accumulated research in multiple countries and with multiple methodologies consistently point to it as one of the most relevant, along with a sedentary lifestyle and the industrial processing of food in general. The political response has arrived late, scattered, and facing organized and well-funded resistance. Mexico introduced a specific tax on sugary drinks in January 2014. The measure was implemented despite a massive campaign by the soda industry that included television ads, intense legislative lobbying, and studies funded by the companies themselves, predicting catastrophic economic effects. Consumption of sugary drinks dropped approximately 12% in the first year the tax was applied, according to independent studies published in public health journals. The United Kingdom passed its own tax on sugar in drinks in 2018. The most revealing reaction was not that of consumers, but of manufacturers. Before the tax went into effect, most major soft drink producers reformulated their products to reduce the sugar content below the threshold that placed them in the highest tax bracket. They did it in months. They had had decades to do it voluntarily and had not done so. They needed the economic pressure of a government regulation to move what scientific evidence alone had not moved. Several US cities, including Berkeley, Philadelphia, and Seattle, have passed their own local taxes on sugary drinks, with results that independent studies call modest but statistically significant. The sugar and soda industries have spent tens of millions of dollars on lobbying campaigns and funding referendums and litigation to stop these regulations in the states where they have been proposed. The investment reveals something about the dimension of the interests at stake. You don't spend that money to defend a product whose impact is marginal. Global sugar production today exceeds 180 million tons annually. Brazil is the largest producer in the world, exporting sugar to more than 150 countries. The second is India, the very subcontinent where 5,500 years ago, someone first boiled the juice of a cane and waited to see if it crystallized. Average global consumption is approaching 23 kilograms per person per year, with enormous variations between countries. Europeans and North Americans are above the average, but the fastest growing curve is that of Southeast Asian and Sub-Saharan African countries, where the adoption of Western dietary patterns driven by the expansion of fast food chains, the availability of bottled sodas, and the mass marketing of processed foods is replicating in decades, a food transition that in the West took more than a century. The health systems of those countries are not equipped to manage the avalanche of metabolic diseases that this transition generates, because they were built to treat infectious, not chronic, diseases. And the paradigm shift requires resources and infrastructure that many of those countries are building, while already managing the crisis that the industrial diet has imposed on them. There is something about this whole story that I find hard to shake off when I view it in full perspective. Sugar is the only product I know of that has traveled the entire possible arc of human valuation, from sacred medicine to currency of power, to slave fuel, to food for the poor, to weapon of scientific manipulation, to invisible ingredient in almost everything we eat. It has been at the center of medieval religious wars, of Atlantic colonialism, of Caribbean revolutions, of European industrialization, of the corruption of 20th century nutritional science, and of 21st century public health policies. All that generated by a tall grass with a fibrous stalk that someone bit into in a Pacific jungle 10,000 years ago. The history of sugar is not the history of an ingredient. It is the history of how human beings take something sweet and simple and turn it into one of the most efficient vectors of power, exploitation, and transformation that civilization has ever known. It is in your kitchen right now. In your bread, in your ketchup, in your cereals, in that yogurt with a photo of strawberries on the label. 10,000 years of history, compressed into something you probably didn't even look at this morning.